Okay, we're continuing on our series in Esther, coming to a close. Probably, God willingly, next week we'll bring it to a close as we consider the second part of chapter 9 and what is chapter 10. So tonight, with God's help, we're going to be looking at chapter 9. And before we do that, just maybe you can turn your Bibles, please, to chapter 9. Just have your Bibles open. Sometimes I've been reading different words to describe or quotes from different authors of how they've described the book of Esther. And Irving L. Jensen, a very well-known author, maybe of an earlier day from America, that's what he says, referring to the book of Esther, and I think he summed it up very well. As he's referring here directly in this quote to the different characters, to Mordecai, to Haman, to the king Ahasuerus, to Esther, and he says this: in these last lessons, we have watched the movements of various characters in the book of Esther. However, whoever the character, the hand of God was recognized behind the scenes. The destinies of God's creatures are all part of a divine design, known fully to God alone. If chance determined those destinies, if it was just luck or chance, the world would have destroyed itself long ago. We serve the true and living God, the only true and living God who is sovereign over all. We serve a God who is in control, and our God is in control, and our God is at work, providentially at work. And there we have, of course, that doctrine of providence. And it's very, very clear in the book of Esther, though God is not mentioned directly by name in the book, you can see God's hand at work the whole way through the story of Esther. And tonight we're coming to a very exciting part as we do consider chapter 9, verses 1 through to 17. And I've given a little title tonight's message of Triumph of the Jews. Remember how God had intervened in the whole situation when Esther made it clear about Haman, and Haman got hung on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. There was still the underlying problem, this decree that went out from the king that on the 13th day in the month of Adar, the last month of what was in the Jewish calendar, the Jewish year, of course, was to be this day where all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the Persian kingdom were to be slaughtered. But then, of course, whenever the king, of course, had got rid of when Haman had been hung on the gallows, there was still that issue, because once a decree had been put out, it couldn't be changed. And Esther presents Mordecai and testifies in chapter 8 to the fact that this is her family, this is her cousin, and explains, and he remembers about Mordecai was the one who saved him from the two eunuchs who were planning to kill him. And of course we see that God gives him an opportunity there in chapter 8, that's what we looked at the last time, and what was a task unfinished. I give them an opportunity. Well, why don't you just go and write another decree, a counter decree? And that's exactly what happened. And just for a few moments before we go into chapter 9 again, as we recap, let's just go back into chapter 8 and verse 9 as we see this decree that was written by Mordecai. This is the counter decree to the one that Haman had already put in place before the king. And verse 9 says of chapter 8, so the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that will assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the province of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. This counter decree, now sent out by the king, it was written by Mordecai, was in giving the Jewish people the opportunity to defend themselves from those who were seeking to kill them on that particular day. Now they had the right from this decree to defend themselves, defend their wives, defend their children. and had the right to defend and take the life of the enemy, and also to take their plunder. And this was very similar wording to what was the decree of Haman. But we're going to see whenever this was fulfilled, which we're going to see now in chapter 9, we're going to see there's maybe one or two differences in how they responded. And that copy then was distributed into every province, it says in verse 13, and published for all the people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. And that gave them about 9 months of preparation to be prepared for that day. One day where there's going to be this slaughter of the Jews, but now that they're right to defend themselves against the enemy. As we look at the last part of that chapter, we see in verse 15, it says, So Mordecai, chapter 8, So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honour. There was no more sackcloth. There was no more mourning. There was no more tears. Because when the first decree went out into all the provinces, that's what happened to Jewish people who lived in those provinces. Remember, they were the minority in all those provinces. They were the minority people, the minority group. And there was mourning, and there was tears, and there's the wearing of sackcloth. But now there was light, gladness, and joy and honour with this new decree. And in every province, verse 17, and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Out of it, there were some Gentiles, of course, who became proselytes. To what point? Well, we don't know, but we'll leave it there. And that brings us into chapter 9. And now we've got to that day, the 13th of the 12th month, in the month of Adar. And this is what it says. Let's read verses 1 through to 4 together as we consider the first part, as we consider the triumph of the Jews. Here we are on D-Day. There it says on the screen, the 13th Adar, the 7th of March, and what is the Gregorian calendar? Our calendar, it would be the 7th of March, the 13th of Adar, which is the 12th month in the Jewish calendar, and it's D-Day. And now just give it a wee subtitle there, verses 1 to 4, from destruction to deliverance. Let's read these verses together. Verse 1 says, Now, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and its decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man, Mordecai, became increasingly prominent. From destruction to deliverance. This day, which was going to be a black and dark day for the Jewish people who lived in all the 127 provinces of Persia. But this day that was going to be a terrible day for them became a day of mighty victory over their enemy. Just look at the way it's worded there in verse 1. In the middle of it there, it says, On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. In those few words, that sentence there, we have the story. In other words, the second decree had victory over the first decree, because the day was coming, they were waiting, and I'm sure Haman, that was his desire. It wasn't just hatred for Mordecai because he didn't bow down, it was hatred towards the Jewish people. These people who didn't follow all the customs of Persia, who were different, had a different culture, different background, different ethnicity. And he obviously, it was certainly anti-Semitic, he certainly had a hatred towards the Jewish people. And it wasn't only him going to see that, because the amount of people that were killed on that day was quite vast. So there was a whole lot more than Haman hated the Jewish people. And if we consider the history of the Jewish people right to modern day, there's still people today, right now in 2022, who have a great hatred towards the Jewish people, God's people of the Old Testament. And we don't need to mention Hitler. He tried to annihilate them completely. And he slaughtered millions of them. But you know what? He hasn't destroyed them completely, and no one ever will. Because they're God's people. I like that phrase. On that day, the enemies, verse 1, of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. The opposite occurred, and the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. Verse 2, it says, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. They were not the aggressors. This was their self-defense. They were defending themselves. They were defending their wives and their children. And these other folks were coming to harm them. And as I've been preparing this and considering this and thinking it over, surely after the second decree went out, they would have got the message. I think they would have got it. That maybe it's not such a good idea to try and do anything against the Jewish people because now they have the right to defend themselves. But it just goes to show that the hatred was still there and it was very real. And they were still determined, even with the second decree or the counter decree. So it says there in verse 2 again, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. That's not the first time we hear this in Scripture about the children of Israel or the Hebrew people. Even whenever they were going into the promised land, the fear of them fell upon the people in the promised land. And it says in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 25, this day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the nations under the whole of heaven, who shall hear the report of you and shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. God was going to put a fear into the people's hearts because of this people, this group of people who were coming. The Hebrews, the Jewish people. And also reminds me, remember when the spies were sent into to spy out in the promised land and sent into Jericho, not the 12, it's the 2 that were sent into Jericho. And over in Joshua chapter 2, let's turn to it if we can, just for a few moments. And remember, the 2 spies went over and they went to Rahab's house. And she was going to protect them, and we see this lady. Well, we know what her house was and what she was. And maybe the worst of sinners. So Joshua chapter 2, and I'm just going to read verses 8 through to 11. And here we have the 2 spies, and they're up on the roof in Rahab's house. And this is what she says, referring to these people who are coming over the Jordan, who've crossed over and they're coming into the promised land. And remember, Jericho was a city with impregnable walls. They were so thick and so high. And they didn't even have to do anything. They just walked around it, remember? The trumpet sound and the shout. And the walls came tumbling down. And only Rahab and her family were saved. Remember? Verse 8 says, now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, this is Rahab speaking now, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Look what it says. That the terror of you has fallen on us. And that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. There's half the battle won, isn't that right? For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone, because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. We're faint-hearted. We're fearful. There's great fear amongst us. And here we have the same. Back over in Esther chapter 9, the last part of verse 2. Because fear of them fell upon all people. It's not the first time this fear came upon other people groups because of the people of God. You know, what about us today? When the world sees us, God's people, today, the Church of Jesus Christ, what does the world see when it sees us, the people of God? Is it truly evident that God is at work amongst us? You could say Rahab had reason, and there was reason for the people because of what God done at the Red Sea with the Egyptians, what God done crossing over the River Jordan in flood season, what God done, the victory they had over the enemies on the west side of the Jordan, the two kings. And surely that was why fear came in, because they seen the impossible being done, and they had evidence of the fact there's something different about these people. Yes, of course, these mighty miracles were performed, but the people around could see it, and great fear came upon them. But what about the world today? Do they have fear of us? I'm not talking about us going out and threatening the world around us, no. But is God evident in the church, collectively and individually? Is there anything they see in us which would make them fear God? Folks, you might not realize, but we can be forces to be reckoned with if we truly are living for God and surrender to God. When God is taking control of every aspect of our life, because it becomes so evident there's something different. Remember Shane last week? I know I certainly enjoyed Shane. I think we all enjoyed Shane last week because he just pours out his heart. Maybe what we didn't know is he didn't actually speak or preach much. He just shared about his ministry. We could have listened to him for hours. But he told the story about how he went to that camp, the Pentecostal camp, and how his other brethren and friend who'd been witnessing to him had told him, you need to be careful, it's going to be a bit different there. It's going to be a way out, a wee bit. They're going to do all sorts of hands are going to be in there and all sorts of carry on. Remember what he said last week? He said, but when he's seen them, he's seen something different in them. And he wanted it. He wanted it. Folks, we can be like that as well, where people see it and it's so evident. I want to share this comment by Warren Wiersbe, who consider that about the people see or have the fear of God because they see God in